You're listening to Miss Style, Strength, and Grace with Deidra Murphy. This is your one-stop shop for style, fashion, health, and fitness. Deidra's passion is to help empower women to reach their fullest potential, both inside and out. Deidra and her guests will be discussing how to develop your style, health, and lifestyle hacks to energize your day and inspire you to keep reaching higher levels of success. Deidra is a professional fashion stylist, health guru, and Mrs. Washington 2017. It's time to get open and honest with Deidra.
Well, hello and welcome to today's episode. I am super excited to be here as always. And today I'm kind of mixing it up a little bit and I'm doing kind of a question and answer session here, which I actually do every week over on my Facebook as well as my YouTube channel. So if you don't follow me on those platforms, head to Facebook and look up Deidra Murphy, Miss Style, Strength, and Grace, because every week on Trendy Tuesday, I do a quick style Q&A video where I answer questions specifically from my audience on their style questions or burning desires that they want to know for wardrobe and fashion. So be sure to check those out every Tuesday. And then the next day on Wednesdays, they actually drop over on my YouTube channel as well. So like I said, I love to do Q&A sessions. Those are normally more related to fashion and styling. Today is about a wellness and health question. So this is actually from one of my clients. She texted me after a Wellness Wednesday and was like, hey, on your next one, can you answer this question? And it's such a deep and invested question that I was like, I'm going to do a whole podcast on this question. So the question is, gluten versus dairy versus sugar, what is the worst offender? Wow. Big loaded question right there. So I really wanted to take the appropriate time and really dive in onto this topic. So let's first kind of lay the groundwork here and let's talk about food allergies first. So obviously, if there's a food allergy, that's going to be a worst offender. Just the other night, my husband and I watched a documentary about food allergies. Yeah, we're weirdos. We watch documentaries on Netflix instead of Game of Thrones, which I've actually never watched. I'm like the 1% of the population that's never watched Game of Thrones. So if it's great, maybe let me know. Tell me why I should watch it. I don't know. Right now, I'm still kind of binge watching Grey's Anatomy from the very beginning. So anyway, it got us thinking about, food allergies, and there's a huge discussion as to, why more and more people are developing food allergies, and specifically kids. They said, I think like 1 in 13 kids are being diagnosed with a food allergy. And I was like doing the math. I'm like, oh my gosh, that means 2 kids in every classroom roughly across the country have a food allergy. Especially when I was teaching back in the day, I had to be really careful with food allergies and kids in my classroom. If any child had a nut allergy, I had to make sure that everything was wiped down and clean enough. If a student in my class had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich at lunch they had packed from home, I had to make sure that kid was not sitting next to a student that had a nut allergies, or if I even brought nuts into the classroom for my own lunch, like making sure I was thoroughly washing my hands, wiping down everything. It's a big process. So obviously, if you have a food intolerance or an allergy, that would be the most harmful to your body. For gluten specifically, people with celiac cannot even be around gluten. And again, it depends on how severe the food allergy is. I had a friend a number of years ago, we're still friends, but when I first discovered she actually has celiac, I didn't understand how much work and how thoughtful she has to be about everything, not only that she eats, but even what she touches. So I remembered at the time I had just purchased some shampoo and conditioner, and it was all organic. And I said, it even said it's gluten-free on the bottle. And I couldn't imagine why, because you wouldn't eat or drink shampoo or conditioner. And she explained to me that if you have celiac, and especially to the level where she has it, even if you touch shampoo or conditioner that has any source or form of gluten on there, she would break out in these hives and have a reaction all over her body. So it just kind of blew my mind that it creates such a monumental, problem in her life. And I'm sure she's learned how to cope and adapt for who she is now. But yeah, obviously if you have a celiac intolerance or any sort of gluten intolerance, even if it's a just a minor issue with gluten as far as like tummy problems, then I would stay away from it. Dairy, again, if you have an issue with lactose intolerance, then again, I would stay away from the dairy, obviously, and food allergies in general lead to that. But now that we've kind of laid that groundwork, let's talk about these groups, and I'm going to talk about them in order from like least offensive to most offensive as far as its effects on the body, not only with the time being, so maybe pain, like inflammation, bloating, that kind of thing, even to long-term effects, what I think has the most harmful effect on the body long-term. So gluten. Overall, it's not bad necessarily. I think gluten especially gets a bad rep in our world nowadays because everyone thinks it's really trendy to go like gluten-free. I don't eat gluten. But then I've seen one of those Jimmy Fallon episodes where they go around and they ask people like running around the park of LA, like, are you gluten-free? What is gluten? Why are you gluten-free? And just obviously they pick the dumbest people to show on the episodes, but they will say things like, oh, gluten's in everything. It's in rice, it's in corn, it's in vegetables. Okay, no, it's not. Gluten is found in wheat products. So it's usually, yes, found in carb high foods like breads, pastas, but if something is rice based, then it's going to be naturally gluten-free. Your vegetables are going to be gluten-free. So that's what gluten is. But especially like highly processed gluten. So the ones that are going to be in like your breads and your pastas, those things are what actually cause a majority of the problems, not only with like obviously gluten intolerances, but even just digestive issues, tummy problems. A long time ago, probably like over 6 years ago now, I was prepping for Miss Washington USA, and just to kind of help lean out, and I didn't really know much about carbs and sugars and grams of this or grams of that, I cut out all carbs. Like I didn't have rice, I didn't have quinoa, I didn't have anything that was like a high carb except for vegetables and some limited fruits. Again, that was like, I didn't know what else to do. And that was what my trainer told me to do, just like cut all carbs. So I didn't have any source of gluten in my diet for about 6 months. And then the night after the pageant, I was like, yes, I've put in all this hard work. The pageant's over. I didn't win, but I went to the Cheesecake Factory because A, I love cheesecake, but B, I wanted to have like an indulgence meal. So I had pasta it was obviously high in fat and a lot of like cheeses and dairy. And then also I had cheesecake afterwards. And because I hadn't introduced those foods in my system for so long, and then I had them, I was paying for it for about 3 to 4 days. I was having tummy issues and problems, I'm sure you can imagine. And I definitely paid for it, but I realized, oh my goodness, I might have a slight intolerance to gluten. And what's funny is a couple years ago, so I think it's been 2 years now, we went on a trip with my in-laws over to Italy. And obviously we were having a lot of pasta and a lot of carbs, but I didn't have any tummy issues over there. And, I haven't done a ton of intensive research on it, but a lot of people say this too when they go to European countries, especially Italy, and they have pasta and carbs, they don't have tummy issues because it's more of a naturally occurring form of gluten. So the way that they process the wheat to put in the pasta to make the dishes, it's not as like refined as the process that we use here. It's a little more raw, a little more less processed, so your body can actually break it down easier and it's more digestible. Which that, comes to a whole other topic of like the food industry in America, which we're not going to go down that road, but just the less processed that it is, the easier it is for your system to digest. So similarly, dairy, that's kind of the next topic. So like I said, I'm going to order them in like most offensive to like, least offensive to most offensive. Dairy can get a bad rep because it's it's a fatty food group, but it can actually be good for you when it's less processed. And if it's from organic, grass-fed cows, and even raw cheeses and milks when possible. So especially like raw cheeses and yogurt and butter, it's easier to find than raw milk. So why go raw? Well, raw means that it's been pasteurized, and pasteurization does help make products more shelf stable, and it helps them pass Food and Drug Administration regulations, but it also kills the good quality of dairy products, like the beneficial bacteria and the beneficial flora that's naturally found in the cheeses and the yogurts and the milk. So raw yogurt especially can be a good way to restore balance to a gut, and can help with like fighting of candida. Candida is yeast in the body, and yes, yeast can appear in a lot of places, especially for women. So if you're struggling with any sort of like yeast infections regularly, or you have a high count of yeast in your gut, good raw, the key word is raw, dairy can actually help restore that balance. But I do caution with dairy products and inflammation. So if you have any sort of arthritis issue, rheumatoid arthritis, I would stay away from the dairy because it does cause inflammation in the joints, even bloating. So if you have any sort of struggle with inflammation in your joints or bloating or rheumatoid arthritis or arthritis, I would stay away from milk or dairy products overall. Milk especially is really hard to get raw. In fact, a lot of states specifically ban raw milk. I know in the state that I live in, it's actually the case. So I would recommend switching to a milk alternative if you really want a milk product. So there's lots of alternatives out there: coconut milk, almond milk. I know it may be hard at first because it's a different flavor. It's not bad. It's just a different taste than regular dairy milk. But if you try it out, you take it give it a good month or so to try and acquire the taste. It's different, but it's still yummy. Personally, I prefer almond milk to coconut milk, and I prefer the unsweetened. Again, that's the other thing, is you want to make sure it's unsweetened or not full of sugar. Almond milk, and I like it with a little bit of vanilla flavoring. So there's a brand called Pacific, I think, and it has almond milk. It's unsweetened with a little bit of vanilla flavoring to it, and I think it tastes amazing. Like, I'll even just drink a glass of it, or I'll put it in my coffee, or if, we on occasion might have some sort of cereal or granola and I need like a milk product to put in there, that's what I choose. Sometimes I'll throw almond milk or coconut milk in my smoothies, but it just depends on what I'm feeling that day. If you're looking for a milk alternative, I would suggest stay away from soy milk. So little information about soy is, number one, most of the soy in the United States, so like 90% of soy in the United States is actually GMO'd. So, it's harder to find without the being genetically modified. And there's, a whole other rabbit hole we can go down with genetically modified organisms or GMO products. But secondly, with soy specifically, is it actually mimics estrogen, and that can lead not only to breast cancer, but other hormone imbalances, especially female issues. But even in men, if men are drinking a lot of soy milk or having a lot of soy products, because it is an estrogen mimicker, they might have issues even with their breast tissue and hormone imbalances as well. If you are going to use soy products, I would 100% make sure it's organic and non-GMO, and just limit your intake overall. The next reason to, limit or reduce the amount of milk you drink or use is because of the sugar content. So lactose is a fancy word for a type of sugar that's naturally occurring in milk. But the dirty little secret of the dairy industry is that they actually will add sugar to milk to make it taste better. It's a sneaky little trick they do to make us want it even more. I remember growing up and at dinner time, it was either a glass of milk or a glass of water that I had with dinner. Milk was a huge part of my diet growing up. And it wasn't until later that I learned that I had all these reactions to it, and that it really was better for my system, and my system functioned better overall when I took out the dairy products. Now I'll still eat raw cheeses and sometimes raw yogurt on occasion, but it's not a huge portion of what I eat. So like I just mentioned, the dairy industry will add sugar to milk, which leads me to the last offender of sugar. So if there's one major offender that is the top of the list of these three items, it is sugar. That is the number one thing I would encourage you to reduce the intake of. Now, keep in mind, not all sugars are created equal. Sugars naturally occurring in fruit, naturally occurring in things like honey, agave nectar, they're more complex, meaning your body has to burn more calories in order to break it down, and it's harder for your body to store as fat because it's not a simple sugar or a really refined sugar. Now, that's not a free pass to just eat only fruit and fill up on a ton of honey and agave nectar, but I'm just saying, like, use those types of sugars instead of the highly processed and refined sugars. So simple or, more refined sugars are the things that we're going to find in processed, packaged food, the high fructose corn syrups, the table sugars, obviously the baked goods and the sweets, but you're even going to find these types of sugars in unsuspecting culprits like the bagged chips. You'd be surprised how much sugar is actually in that bag of like Frito-Lay or, tortilla chips. It's obviously too in the sodas and the canned drinks, which I would just recommend to avoid overall. There's, so much research on why you should avoid soda and other pops and canned drinks, but let's stick to just talking about sugar right now. So the benefit to sticking to like a naturally found sugar is not only is it more complex, but it's usually less of it. So there's a lot less sugar in an apple than a candy bar. I know you're saying, yeah, I get it, right? We all know like an apple way better than a Snickers bar for you. But why? Why should we reduce the amount of sugar we're eating? Number one, sugar leads to fat storage. We all know that, right? Like eating a ton of donuts and cupcakes all day, you're going to lead to some weight gain versus if you're eating naturally found fruits and vegetables and other sources of carbs along with a balanced diet of fats and proteins, you're probably either going to at least maintain or lose weight. But let's talk about things other than just the waistline. Sugar is actually addicting. It's just as addicting as cocaine because it creates the dopamine effect in our brain, and that's what leaves us craving more. Remember those old commercials, like probably in the 90s or even like early 2000s? I can't remember what brand of chips it was. I want to say it was like Lay's potato chips, but they used to say, I bet you can't eat just one. Well, it's because there's sugar in there and it's usually the high fructose corn syrup. And so our brains are addicted. We can't like turn that mechanism off and we just want more. Sugar obviously spikes blood sugar, but that can lead to diabetes, especially type 2 diabetes. I think I recently talked about it in a different episode, but I was diagnosed with prediabetes a few years ago. That's when I knew I had to like make some major changes in my life, but it's had such an impact on me because I've seen the effect of type 2 diabetes on my loved ones. I've mentioned uncles and aunts that all had type 1 diabetes, but even my own grandmother developed type 2 diabetes later in life. And I've just seen the amount of changes that she's had to go through because of that. And I would rather avoid that route. And I hope you would too. I hope you don't want to, develop type 2 diabetes or type 1 if that's something that you were born with. I know there's probably a lot that you can even teach the rest of us about living with type 1 diabetes. Sugar is also one of the main causes of inflammation, which I know I've mentioned before, not just like with joint inflammation, but cellular at the cellular level. So what that does is it actually suppresses our immune system. So that's number one, why we definitely want to avoid sugar when we're feeling any sort of illness like a cold or a flu coming on, is it actually suppresses our immune system so we stay sicker longer. I did a little Wellness Wednesday like right before the holidays about how to kick colds and flus in the butt, and that's one of the best ways to help fight off a cold or flu early on is to avoid sugars, even the naturally occurring ones like from fruits, because it's just going to lower your immune system when you're trying to fight off and up that white blood cell count. Another reason to avoid the sugar is it'll actually give you more energy. So that quick sugar fix, that sugar high may give you that, needed burst of energy right then, but you're going to go through that sugar rapidly and end up with a crash. Instead, fill up with good proteins and healthy fats. If you haven't yet, listen to my Healthy Fats 101 podcast to help feel not only fuller, but have that energy sustain you longer through the day. Another reason for, avoiding the sugar and why I think it's the biggest offender is it's linked to chronic disease. So it's not only linked to high blood pressure, also diabetes, like I mentioned before, but it's also linked to our cognitive function. So have you ever had that brain fog after you've had, maybe a ton of sugar and you're like, I just don't understand what's going on in the world right now. I can't think. Well, in the long run, that has been linked to Alzheimer's as well. But lastly, sugar also feeds cancer cells. So that's a whole other topic I could go down as well. If you haven't looked it up yet, there's a book called The Cancer Killers. I can't remember who it's written by, but it shows the research behind why sugar is actually linked to cancer and how sugar feeds the rapid reproduction of cancer cells. My last reason, this one is one that is really near and dear to my heart, is better sleep. I know when I've indulged in too much sugar, like maybe after my birthday and I've had a lot of cake or an ice cream, I don't sleep well that night. And for me, insomnia is not something to mess around with. So I do whatever I can for a good night's rest. And if that means, avoiding and limiting my sugar intake throughout the day, that's worth it for me because I know what I'm like at my worst when I'm only getting 1 to 2 hours of sleep, and I don't want to go down that path again. Okay, now that we've listed them out from least to worst offenders, what can we do instead? So number 1, do not use artificial sweeteners. The Splendas, the little pink and blue packs at the restaurants and the little boxes. Definitely avoid those. They are not only a neurotoxin, but your body can't recognize it. So whatever your body cannot recognize, it cannot metabolize. And then that's what it stores as fat. So that's why people that continually drink, the diet sodas and the Coke Zero, they're full of artificial sweeteners, yet that person still is maybe overweight. Well, it's because their body can't metabolize those artificial sweeteners, even though that drink might have technically 0 grams of sugar. The next tip is to reduce the added sugars. So again, reducing the brown sugars, the table sugars, the additives that we're having in our foods, and switch to a natural sweetener alternative. So some good ones are stevia in the liquid or the powder form, your choice. I prefer, if I'm just putting in like a drink like coffee, to use the liquid form. It kind of dissolves a little bit better and it doesn't quite have a little bit of a bitter taste that like the powdered version of stevia does. That's just my preference. So play around with it. I like a brand called Pure, and it's Pyure, Pure liquid stevia. Stevia itself is natural because it's occurring from a natural plant leaf, and it's an extract from that plant leaf. And the nice thing about it too is it won't actually spike your blood sugar levels. So it's a safe alternative. Another alternative is xylitol, and that's spelled with an X. It's okay to use on occasion. It does come from a plant, but it still has a carb load and it should be used sparingly. I found that xylitol actually works best for baking. So my mom actually has a great pumpkin cheesecake recipe that she makes over Thanksgiving, and it's used with xylitol. I think she had to play around with the recipe a couple times to get it quite right. I mean, like I said, it still has some things in there that you wouldn't want to eat on a regular basis, and it still has a carb load on there, but it's a better alternative to like a fully loaded sugar cheesecake during the holidays. Another tip is to go with more natural forms of sugar. So like I said, they will still have sugar and grams of sugar in there, but they're in a more complex form. So they won't have as big of a glycemic load or glycemic index of them to them. That means that they won't spike your blood sugar quite as much. And the other good thing is you don't need very much. A little bit goes a long way. So by talking about the natural forms of sugar, like raw honeys, agave nectar, sugars that are in fruits like berries, apples, those have a lower, not only content of sugar, but lower glycemic level index. Do mix your sugars and your fruits with like good fats and proteins to help keep from raising your blood sugar levels. For example, if you do want to have a banana, which is actually a fruit that has a higher sugar content, mix it with 1 to 2 tablespoons of almond butter. So not only are you getting those good carbs from the banana, but you're also getting in some good protein and fats to help slow down the digestive process of that snack. So overall, reducing sugar loads, I mean, it's hard to completely eliminate sugar, will lead to more health benefits. So the next question is, how much should we have, right? Like, okay, you're telling me to reduce sugar, but then you say you can't completely eliminate sugar. Like, how much do I have? Well, the American Heart Association recommends only 20 grams of sugar for women and only 36 grams for men. Okay, let's put that into some perspective. That means that 1 8-ounce glass of orange juice has about a little over 20 grams of sugar. And there you go. That's your sugar intake for the day, right? I know, that's kind of overwhelming. But in comparison, 1 orange only has about 10 to 15 grams of sugar. So number 1, my biggest tip is to eat your fruit instead of drink it. I can go on a whole nother podcast topic about juicing, and there is benefits to juicing. I recommend juicing more vegetables like beets, carrots, spinach, rather than a lot of fruit, just to help lower the sugar content. Another tip is to remove the sources from your house, the table sugars, the syrups, the molasses, like get them out of your cupboards. If they're not there, you can't eat them. Get out the junk food. And over time, reduce the amount that you're using. So for instance, if you're used to putting a couple heaping tablespoons of sugar in your coffee every day, maybe cut that in half 1 week, the next week, cut that in half, the next week, cut that in half, and just keep going down until you've almost eliminated it. And I promise you it will get easier over time. Drink a lot of water instead of juices, sodas, and other beverages. Focus on fresh fruits and vegetables instead of canned. And even try spices like cinnamon or nutmeg instead to kind of give that sweetness feeling without adding actual sugar. I actually add a little bit of cinnamon to my coffee to give it a little bit of that sweet taste with no sugar. I know locally there's a coffee shop here called The Local, actually, and they have a tea, and it's a cinnamon tea. I know they have it during the holidays, and it tastes sweet. Like it tastes like I'm drinking some sort of sugared concoction, but it's not. It's just like a cinnamon-based tea. There's no sugar in it, and it's herbal. I don't know. It was one of the best things I found over the holidays, and I just loved it. Overall, like I said, I think sugar is the biggest offender. So try to reduce the amount of sugar in your diet, and you'll notice huge health benefits in the long run. So if you haven't yet, go over to my link in the show notes where I also am talking about my fat burning smoothie recipes. So these are some ways that you can introduce good sugars with like fruits and even vegetables into fat burning smoothies that will help boost your metabolism from the get-go. And I know I love them. I look forward to drinking my smoothie every single morning. So I will put the link for my fat burning smoothie recipes in the show notes. Be sure to check that out. And as always, I love you all.
Hey ladies, thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed today's episode. To help empower more women, please be a doll and rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. For show notes and other free resources we mentioned today, go to stylebydeidra.com.